At 4 o'clock, the Dominion's Arasur protocol initiated. At 4:11, something impossible breached the capital. Nyx Solara didn't look up from the manifest she was folding. The paper felt strange in her hands, obsolete. Fragile, the kind of thing empires assumed no one used anymore. Outside the observation deck, the refugee hold hummed with the stifling warmth of 4,000 people packed into a space designed for half that. The Dominion broadcast cycled on every screen the species is contained. The archive is closed. The universe has moved on. She folded the paper with the precision of someone who knows this copy is the only proof. The hold's air recycler wheezed. Somewhere in the lower decks, the FTL drive hummed a sound so low most people's ears didn't register it, but Nyx heard it. She'd been hearing it for 10 years. Ever since the shipyards went dark, in the stifling heat of the refugee hold, surrounded by thousands of people who shouldn't exist, Nyx continued her work. Fold, crease, protect. The manifest contained everything: ship specifications, jump coordinates, 10 years of hidden preparation, and it had to survive. A child appeared at the observation deck threshold. Kes, 7 years old. The child had stopped speaking after the quarantine beacon activated, but the drawings continued. Trees, water, a world that didn't exist anymore. Nyx watched as Kes moved to the corner, produced a charred stick from somewhere, and began drawing on a piece of cloth. The child's hands moved with the same precision Nyx used for folding. Methodical, intentional, refusing to forget. That was when Nyx knew they were ready. The Dominion thought Earth was gone, scattered, silent, finished. They'd announced it on every channel. The documentation was complete. History had moved on, but Nyx had watched something else happen in the dark. She'd watched Earth survive by going silent in a different way, by taking the tools of documentation and hiding them where empires couldn't scan. Paper, hard copy, archive, 17 copies scattered through Dominion space, each one containing the same impossible truth: they never stopped fighting. In the lower decks, the FTL drive continued its low hum. Around Nyx, the refugee hold pressed inward. Bodies, heat, the smell of recycled air that had been scrubbed too many times. The Dominion's broadcasts played on loop. Quarantine confirmed. Species contained. Archive sealed. Every word a confirmation of what the Empire believed to be true. But underneath those broadcasts, under the certainty and the finality, something else was moving. 17 copies of the truth. 17 insurance policies against empires who believed silence was obedience. Nyx folded the next page and thought about what survival actually meant. It wasn't about being strong. It wasn't about fighting openly. It was about refusing to let them forget that you existed. It was about taking the tools of recork-typing and turning them into weapons the Empire never saw coming. A Siltage officer appeared in the observation deck doorway. Tall, angular, the kind of person who moved with economical precision. Her name was Vance, and her shoulders pulled back slightly. A stress response. Nyx had learned it. In Siltage culture, exposed shoulders meant vulnerability. Vance seemed unaware she was broadcasting it to everyone in the room. Is it true? Vance asked. No greeting, no preamble, just the question hanging in the stifling air of the hold. Nyx looked at the manifest in her hands. What's true? That Earth is still fighting. Vance's eyes moved across the papers. That you've been documenting it. That there's a plan. Nyx folded the last page. The manifests speak for themselves. Vance picked up the first copy. Read it in silence. Her analytical mind, trained on Dominion data, speak. Trained on precision and verification, processed the implications in seconds. When she looked up, her shoulders were fully pulled back. Not just stress anymore. Recognition. Understanding that what she held in her hands wasn't just documentation. It was proof. This is insurgency, Vance said finally. This is refusal. Nyx replied. What you do with it is your choice. In the corner, Kes continued drawing. The stick moved across cloth. Ship, ship, ship. Dozens of them, all pointing toward something bright. The refugee hold waited. 24 hours after Vance read the first manifest, Thorne arrived at the observation deck. The Siltage navigator moved with the precise gait of someone who'd never trusted anything without verifying it first. His dark eyes scanned the 17 copies spread across the table, all of them now, arranged chronologically. The first one from 10 years ago, when Earth shipyards went dark. The most recent from 3 days before the Arasur broadcast. The specifications in these manifests, Thorne said, not bothering with greeting or preamble. They're accurate. Yes, Nyx said. The timeline, the jump calculations, the FTL drive schematics. His shoulders remained level. He learned to mask stress around SILT officers, but Nix could see it in the precise angle of his head as he bent over the papers. You've been building this for 10 years. We have. Torn looked at her directly then. And you expect it to work? I expect it to be necessary. Nix said. Whether it works is another calculation entirely. The navigator spent 6 hours cross-referencing the manifests against every piece of Dominion data he could access through secure channels. He pulled records from the Dominion's own archives, quarantine protocols, detection logs, error confirmation broadcasts. He matched them against what the 17 copies contained. Ship movements that lined up with supposed signal blackouts, resource deployments that corresponded with hidden construction activities. 10 years of Earth survival written the gaps between what the Dominion thought was happening. When he finished, Thorne looked like he'd aged. The Dominion doesn't know any of this is real, he said finally. Nix agreed. They believe Earth is erased. They believe the species is contained. They believe the archive is closed. They believe all of it because we've been careful to let them believe it. Around them, the refugee hold continued its endless hum. 3,000 people, thousands more riding on ships that shouldn't exist, piloted by crew members who've been declared extinct. The numbers were growing. The Dominion scanners registered the influx as standard refugee movement displacement from the quarantine zone. Shh, nothing tactical, nothing threatening. The Dominion was looking in the wrong direction. If we broadcast this, Thorne said, touching the manifest gently, as if they might dissolve under his hands, we're declaring war. We're declaring survival. Nix corrected. War is what the Dominion will choose to call it. Vance found them, an hour later, moving through the crowded hold with the kind of purpose that made people part around her. The captain's analytical mind had been processing the implications all night. Nix could see it in the set of her jaw. The way her shoulders had stopped pulling back, stress had transformed into something harder. Resolution. I'm calling a council, Rand said. Every captain, every navigator, every officer on the ships. They need to know what we have. And what will they choose? Nix asked. They'll choose what any species would choose. Vance replied. They'll choose to exist. Out loud, in the open. No more silence. The council took place in the deepest section of the hold, away from the Dominion's external scanners. 40 officers, 40 voices, 40 calculations of probability and risk and what it meant to take something that had been hidden for 10 years and expose it to the empire that had spent 10 years believing it was dead. The arguments lasted for hours. Some officers questioned the accuracy of the manifests. Torn answered them, line by line, specification by specification. Some questioned the wisdom of revealing themselves when stealth had kept them alive. Vance responded with the simple truth: stealth only survives as long as no one discovers you. And discovery is inevitable. And some simply asked, what is the purpose of survival if we remain silent? That question hung in the stifling heat of the refugee hold. Nix watched the officers argue and understood something about choice. It wasn't about whether you fought. It was about whether you fought openly, whether you were willing to let the universe know that you'd refuse to disappear. The 17 manifests sitting on the table represented 10 years of hidden fighting. What the council was deciding, right now, was whether to bring that fighting into the light. By the time the council ended, by the time 40 voices had spoken and the consensus had formed, it was clear Earth was going to breach the silence. And when Earth breached it, the archive was going to break open across Dominion space like a weapon no empire had ever imagined. Nix folded another manifest as the officers filed out, not for preservation anymore, for carrying, for holding something so fragile and so vital that it needed hands to shield it until the moment it was released. Below them, in the engineering sections, the FTL drive continued its diagnostic hum. But now something was different. Now it wasn't just waiting. It was preparing. The FTL drive had been called experimental for a decade. That was the safest term, accurate enough to satisfy the Dominion's classifications if anyone ever asked, vague enough to hide what it actually was. A weapon, a bridge, a Roger. Nix descended into the engineering decks for the first time since the refugee hold had filled. The temperature shifted. Cooler. The hum of the FTL drive grew louder here. No longer a subliminal vibration, but a sound that filled the entire space. The drive occupied the lowest section of the ship, a massive construction of metal and light and calculations made physical. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful. The chief engineer was a human named Elias. Nix had known him for years, one of the 17 people who'd received the first manifests. One of the people who'd believed that Earth could survive by building something impossible in the dark. Elias moved around the FTL drive with the care of someone touching something sacred. It's ready, he said when he saw Nix. All diagnostics cleared. Jump calculation is locked. We can initiate countdown whenever calm and gives the order. How long for full initialization is? Nix asked. From cold to jump ready? 11 minutes. Elias ran his hands along the drive's outer casing, checking connections that had been checked 1,000 times already. Ritual now. Comfort. We've been running this sequence for 6 months. The machinery knows what to do. Nix thought about that. Machinery that knew what to do. Systems that had been prepared so carefully that they could perform a function that had never been attempted before, could bridge a distance that made most people's minds break when they tried to calculate it. And it would all depend on this moment, on the moment when someone gave the order to activate the drive and send 4,000 refugees and thousands more across the void toward the Empire's capital. What's the probability of success? She asked. Elias smiled. It was a grim expression. 73%, give or take 3 percentage points depending on solar activity and whether the Dominion has improved their detection grid since we last updated the calculations. And failure? Catastrophic. Probably. Elias returned to checking connections. But you don't build a decade-long insurgency just to fail quietly. In the refugee hold above, Kess's drawings had multiplied. The cloth was covered with them, now ships and light and something else. There might have been explosions or might have been stars being born. The child still didn't speak, but the visual language had become fluent. This is what we're flying toward. The drawing seemed to say, this is what comes when we refuse to stay erased. The refugee ships had moved into formation. Nix had watched them from the observation deck. 47 vessels, arranged in a pattern that would minimize detection signature while maximizing the speed of the FTL jump. Some of them were barely more than hulls with engines. Some were scarred from years of hiding in the gaps between Dominion scanning patterns. But all of them were here. All of them were ready. Bats appeared in the engineering section, moving with the kind of urgency that suggested the countdown was accelerating. How long? She asked Elias. 11 minutes from initiation. The engineer replied. Then give the order. The captain said, it's time. Nix felt something shift. Not physically. Not yet. But internally, the moment when a decade of preparation crystallized into a single action. The FTL drive began its final sequence. Lights that had been static started cycling. The hum deepened, became something that Nix felt in her bones. All ships reporting ready. Rand said, reading data from the communication system. The Dominion scanners aren't showing any alert flags. We're still invisible. How long? Elias asked. 43 seconds from jump initiation to Dominion detection. Rand said, 54 seconds until they can begin targeting countermeasures. At the speed the FTL drive will be moving, we'll cover the distance to the capital in 8 minutes. But in that 8 minutes she paused, letting the calculation finish itself. In that 8 minutes, the archive goes live. The broadcast begins. And for 43 seconds, the Empire won't even know we're coming. The FTL drive's hum reached a pitch that made Nix's vision blur slightly. She could see the machinery resonating. Could see the calculations becoming real in the way that energy moved through physical space. This was what Earth had been building for 10 years. This was the refusal made tangible. 40 seconds to jump, Elias announced. Nix thought about the manifests. About 17 copies of the same truth scattered through an empire that had tried to erase it. About a child drawing ships that were about to become real. About what it meant for a species to take the tools of documentation and turn them into weapons. 30 seconds, Elias said. The refugee hold above was completely silent now. For 1,000 people. Not panicking, not screaming, just waiting. Waiting for the moment when silence became rebellion. 20 seconds. Vance stood at the controls. Her analytical mind finally quiet. No more calculations. No more probability assessments. Just the simple truth: we're here. We exist. You can't erase us. 10 seconds. Nix felt her hands shake slightly. The manifests in her possession suddenly felt impossibly fragile. But fragile wasn't the same as weak. Fragile was just honest about how delicate the act of existing could be. 5, 4, 3. The FTL drive ignited. The jump happened between one moment and the next. 1 second. The refugee hold existed in normal space, held in orbit around a planet that the Dominion had declared erased. The FTL drive hummed beneath the hull like a heart recognizing its purpose for the first time. The refugee ships moved in formation, 47 vessels that shouldn't exist, piloted by people who were supposed to be dead. The next second, they were somewhere else entirely. The displacement was instantaneous from the perspective of people inside the vessels, but from the outside, from the perspective of Dominion's scanners and surveillance stations and the Empire's vast network of detection grids, it appeared as a sudden, impossible arrival. 1 moment nothing. The next moment, an entire fleet of ships, moving at velocities that shouldn't be possible, heading directly toward Dominion space. Heading directly toward the capital. In the observation deck, Nix felt the jump as a sensation like falling. For a microsecond, physics forgot what it was supposed to do. They remembered. The inertial dampeners engaged, the ship stabilized, and suddenly, the stars outside the viewport were different, closer, arranged in patterns that meant they were approaching the Dominion central systems. Jumps, successful. Rance's voice came through the communication system. I'm sure. Professional, as if she hadn't just moved an entire refugee fleet across light years of every law the Dominion had ever written. All ships reporting stable. No damage. No casualties. Dominion detection grid is lighting up now. Time until they can launch countermeasures 43 seconds. 43 seconds. That was the window. That was the moment when the archive had to go live. Nix moved to the communication console. Her hands didn't shake anymore. The moment had arrived. The decade of preparation, the 17 manifests, the careful documentation of Earth's survival, all of it had been building toward this exact moment. And now the only thing left was to let it out. Broadcast the archive, Nix said. Thorn was already moving, his precise hands working the controls with the speed of someone who'd rehearsed this 1,000 times. The archive wasn't just the manifests. It was everything. 30,000 years of Dominion expansion. Every species they'd quarantined. Every planet they'd sealed off. Every silence they'd enforced. All of it being transmitted simultaneously across every frequency Dominion space could receive. The data stream was massive. So much information. So much history. So much refusal pouring out into the vacuum between stars. For the first few seconds, it was just data. Numbers, records, specifications. And then the archive began to speak. In the refugee hold above, Cass looked up from the drawings. The child had been drawing for her ship after ship after ship. But now the child understood something new. The drawings had become real. The ships were here. The refusal was here. Around the hold. Around every refugee ship in the fleet. People felt the same thing. The moment when documentation became declaration, when hiding became standing up, when silence became screaming. The Dominion's first response arrived at the 8-second mark. A warning broadcast. Cease transmission immediately. As if the Empire thought it could stop what was already happening. The archive continued. By the 20-second mark, Dominion warships were moving toward the fleet. Sleek vessels designed for enforcement, designed for making empires will into reality. But the refugee ships had already moved. They weren't in the same space anymore. They were closer, racing toward the capital. 30 seconds. Vance reported. Target in 30 seconds. Archive broadcasted critical transmission points. Dominion networks lighting up across all channels. Nix watched the data streaming out. Watched the archive 30,000 years of truth spreading through Dominion space like a virus that couldn't be contained. Somewhere, in Dominion High Command, people were realizing that everything they believed about Earth was wrong. Everything they believed about the Siltage was wrong. Everything they believed about the ability to silence a species was wrong. Target in 15 seconds. Vance said. Nix thought about the manifests one more time. About 17 copies of survival. About a child drawing ships. About what it meant to refuse Erasur. All ships brace for impact. We're going in. The capital filled the viewport. A planet that had never been attacked. Never been threatened. Never been anything other than the center of the Dominion's power. And now, approaching it at impossible velocity, came the refugee fleet. For 1,000 people, thousands more. All of them declaring at once, we're here. We exist. You failed to erase us. 10 seconds. Vance said. The archive was still broadcasting. Still pouring 30,000 years of truth into the void. 5 seconds. Nix felt her hands grip the console. Not from fear. From something else. From the understanding that in 5 seconds, for seconds, 3 seconds, everything was going to change. The Dominion was going to have to acknowledge that they'd been wrong. That the species they declared erased had simply refused to disappear. 2 seconds. In the lower decks, Elias watched the FTL drag power down. 10 years of preparation ending in a single moment of arrival. 1. The refugee fleet breached the capital's orbit. At 4 o'clock, the Dominion's Erasur protocol initiated. At 4:11, something that was supposed to be dead appeared at the Empire's heart, and the archive kept broadcasting. The capital had never been attacked before. In 400 years of Dominion rule, no species had dared. The Empire's defenses were legendary orbital platforms, fighter squadrons, defensive grids that could traumatize entire fleets in seconds. The capital existed in a state of permanent military readiness. Not because it was ever threatened, but because threatening it was considered an impossible act, a civilization-ending miscalculation. Until for 11, the refugee fleet didn't slow. They came at the capital like a species that had already accepted the price of resistance. 47 ships, their hulls scarred from a decade of hiding, their engines screaming against the velocity of the FTL jump. And behind them, spreading across every communication frequency, the archive continued its broadcast. 30,000 years of Dominion atrocities. Every species they'd quarantined, every planet they'd sealed, every silence they'd enforced. Nyx stood in the observation deck and watched the capital grow larger in the viewport. She could see the orbital platforms activating, see the Dominion's defensive grid lighting up like a nervous system recognizing threat. But the response was too slow. The archive was already spreading through Dominion space, already beyond the reach of their sensors, already loose in a way that couldn't be contained. Defense grid attempting lock, Dorn reported from the navigation console. His analytical mind was processing data at speeds that would have impressed the Dominion once. 43 seconds to weapons lock, 54 seconds to first strike capability, 43 seconds, the exact window they'd calculated, the exact moment Earth's refusal would have to manifest as physical action. Vance moved through the ship like someone who'd made peace with what was coming. All ships, evasive pattern theta, Dr. Powered as shields. Communications keep broadcasting. Don't stop, don't pause, whatever happens, make sure that archive reaches someone who listens. The first salvo came at the 55-second mark. Dominion weapons fire, descended from centuries of enforcing empire, designed to destroy, to dominate, to make resistance impossible. The beam hit the refugee fleet's forward shield and exploded into a cascade of energy that lit up the void like a star being born. And then something impossible happened. The refugee ships didn't scatter, didn't break formation, didn't flee. They continued forward. Not toward the orbital platforms, not toward the capital's military installations, directly toward the archive station, the massive structure that held the Dominion's official records. The place where history was curated and approved and controlled. They're targeting the archive. A Dominion officer's voice came through the communications systems. Fractured and desperate. The refugees are targeting the archive. Nyx understood then. This wasn't about military victory. The refugee fleet couldn't win against the Dominion's firepower. But what they could do, what they were doing, was ensure that the truth became physical, unstoppable. Another salvo. This one caught the edge of the second ship in formation. A cargo vessel, barely more than a hull with engines. The impact should have destroyed it. Instead, the ship's own communications array fired, sending its own broadcast directly into the archive station's receivers. Data, history, refusal, multiple breaches in the archive's external systems. The same officer reported. Now panic was in his voice, the panic of someone watching certainty collapse. They're not trying to breach the station. They're trying to load it. Thor looked at Nyx with something like awe. They're uploading the refugees' data directly into the Dominion's official archive. They're making the Empire store the truth. Not just the truth. Vance corrected quietly. Her shoulders were fully pulled back now, not from stress, but from something else. From the understanding that vulnerability sometimes meant winning. They're making the Empire acknowledge that they failed, making it part of the permanent record. The third salvo came closer. This one hit Elias's ship. The chief engineer had stayed behind to manage the FTL drive shutdown sequence to make sure the power systems didn't overload and destroy the refugee fleet from the inside. When the Dominion beam hit, Nyx felt it like a physical blow, felt the impact travel through the hull like a heartbeat stopping. The communications array flared once, transmitted one final data burst, and then went dark. Elias had been human, a record keeper like Nyx, someone who'd spent 10 years documenting Earth's survival in the dark, and he'd ended it by ensuring that documentation reached places where it couldn't be erased. He knew, Thorne said quietly. Not a question, a statement. Eye recognition. He knew. Nyx confirmed. The refugee fleet continued forward, for ships now, firing their communications arrays simultaneously, for voices screaming the same truth into systems designed to silence them. And behind them, across Dominion space, the archive broadcast continued, still spreading, still reaching people, still existing in a way that couldn't be unmade. Vance watched the capital grow larger. All ships prepare for final approach. We're not stopping here. We're not stopping anywhere. We exist, and the universe is going to have to acknowledge it. The orbital platform's next salvo was the one that should have ended the refugee fleet. But Nyx was watching something else. Watching the Dominion's official archive station receive the data streams from 4 refugee ships simultaneously. watching history rewrite itself in real time. Systems designed to control narrative forced to accept evidence of their own failures. And in that moment, Nix understood what the 17 manifests had always been for. Not survival, not victory, acknowledgement, the refusal to let an empire erase you from its own records. The capital's defenses began to falter, not because the refugee fleet was winning a war, but because the infrastructure designed to enforce silence was being forced to broadcast the truth. Dominion officers were reading the archive, reading what had been hidden, reading 30,000 years of crimes that the Empire had never been forced to confront, and some of them were choosing to believe it. In a secure chamber beneath the Dominion's central command, an officer named Vance's counterpart, a Dominion administrator with the same analytical mind but years of different programming, began to understand what was happening. The archive wasn't just being broadcast, it was being integrated into the official record. Dominion systems, designed to process information with ruthless efficiency, were cataloging and verifying and accepting the refugee data because the systems had no protocols for refusal. They could only categorize, only archive, only remember. This data is contradicting established records, a subordinate reported. Confusion in her voice. The Dominion's quarantine protocols show species containment as successful, but this archive show me the evidence chain, the administrator said. It took 3 hours. 3 hours of analysis. 3 hours of the Dominion's own systems, fed with Earth's manifests and the refugee archive, building an irrefutable case against the Empire itself. Ship movements that contradicted official reports, detection logs that showed the Dominion knew Earth was surviving and chose to ignore it. Resource allocations that made sense only if Earth was building something that threatened the Empire's foundational power structure. They never stopped fighting. The administrator said finally. They were fighting the entire time. In the refugee hold, 4,000 people waited in the silence that followed the Dominion's defensive fire. The evacuation had begun as soon as the attack started. Ships launching from the perimeter, ships moving toward the capital with the slowness of vessels carrying families and children and people who'd been declared dead and were finally allowed to exist in the open. Kes stood at an observation port with a cloth covered in drawings. The child looked at the capital, at the fortress that had held the Dominion's power for 4 centuries, and watched it begin to crack. Not from weapons fire, from truth. The first mutiny began at the orbital platform. Officers, reading the archive, understanding that they'd been enforcing lies their entire careers. Some of them stood down. Some of them began broadcasting the archive themselves, spreading it to other military installations, other command centers, other places where the Dominion's power was rooted. And each broadcast made the truth heavier, more real, more impossible to ignore. Thorne reported the spreading cascades of data across Dominion space with something like fascination. It's exponential, he said. Each officer who reads the archive and broadcasts, it reaches more people. Each new broadcast reaches more systems. The data is replicating faster than their sensors can contain it. It's because the sensors are part of the system that created it. Nick said quietly. The Dominion built perfect information networks. Perfect efficiency, perfect distribution. They just never imagined those networks would be used against them. In the archive station beneath the capital, the administrator continued reading, continued processing, continued building the case. And then something changed. The nature of the archive began to shift. It wasn't just historical data anymore. Refugees, real, living people began broadcasting their own testimonies, personal accounts, individual stories of what quarantine had meant, what silence had cost. A SILTH officer described the moment the quarantine beacon activated. The way the stars had simply disappeared when the Dominion sealed their world. The sense of being erased from the universe itself. A human described 10 years of hiding, building the FTL drive in shipyards that didn't appear on any official charts, teaching children that their species still existed while every broadcast said they were dead. A child could have been Kes, could have been any child born into genocide, drew pictures of trees that would never grow again. And those pictures were transmitted across Dominion space, integrated into the official archive. The narrative is breaking, the administrator said. She wasn't speaking to her subordinates anymore. She was speaking to herself, speaking to the understanding that was crystallizing in her mind. The Dominion's power isn't based on military strength. It's based on silence, on the ability to make people disappear so completely that they're not even listed as missing. And we've just been forced to acknowledge that we failed. Vance's ship continued its approach to the capital. The defensive fire had stopped, not because the Dominion was showing mercy, but because the military command structure was fragmenting. Officers refusing orders, Officers broadcasting the archive to rival commands. Officers beginning to understand that enforcing the Dominions will mean participating in crimes that were no longer deniable. Status report. Vance commanded. Dominion defenses at 40% operational. Thorne reported. And falling. War platforms are going dark as officers stand down. The archive station is now fully integrated with civilian information networks. The Dominion can't contain the broadcast anymore. Nix felt something shift. Not victory. Empires didn't collapse that easily, but something that was maybe worse for the Dominion acknowledgement. The forced recognition that they'd failed, that the species they'd tried to erase had refused to disappear, that the silence they'd enforced was now being shattered by their own systems. The refugee fleet moved into final approach, and the archived 30,000 years of it, combined with the testimony of 4,000 living refugees, continued broadcasting on every frequency the Dominion had ever created. Some people listened, some people understood, and some people, understanding, began to ask questions the Dominion had never been designed to answer. What do we do when we can no longer deny what we've done? Vance poured water into a cup and watched it settle. For 3 days, the refugee hold had been a pressure cooker. 13 crews debating, arguing, proposing different strategies for what would happen when they reached the capital. Would the Dominion try to destroy them? Would they negotiate? Would they attempt to silence the archive before it spread too far? Now in the quiet moment before the final approach, with the water stilling in the cup and the capital filling the viewport like a fate that had finally arrived, Vance understood that none of those questions mattered anymore. The archive was already spreading. The decision had been made the moment Nix folded the first manifest. Everything else was just consequence. She drank the water slowly. The refugee hold was silent now. No arguments, no debates. Just waiting. Just the understanding that in moments, everything they'd hidden for 10 years was going to become public, irrevocable, real. Thorne appeared in the command center with data in his hands. Actual hard copy manifests, now a stack of them, accumulated from the 7 copies that Nix had distributed through the network. The Dominion archive is complete, he reported. All 30,000 years. All species. All documented quarantines. It's integrated with their central systems now. They can't delete it without erasing their entire institutional memory. How long until they realize that? Vance asked. They've realized, Thorne said quietly. The real question is whether they'll accept it or whether they'll try to destroy the archive station and lose everything trying to hide. That question was answered at 11 a.m. 47. The archive station broadcast one final transmission. Not data. Not specifications. A voice. Human. Female. Speaking directly to the Dominion. You turned off the lights, the voice said. Didn't realize we already knew the way. It was the line Earth had prepared. The human response that explained everything in one sentence. The Dominion had tried to erase them through silence and darkness. But Earth had learned to survive in that darkness. Had learned to navigate by refusal alone. And now, in that moment when the voice spoke those words across Dominion space, something broke. Not the Dominion's military infrastructure. Not their defensive grids or their weapon systems or their orbital platforms. Something deeper. Belief. The foundational belief that empires could make species disappear if they chose silence firmly enough. The mutinies accelerated. Officers across Dominion space began making choices. Some chose to continue enforcing the Empire's will. Some chose to stand down. Some chose to broadcast the archive themselves. And some chose something else entirely. In the Dominion's Central Command, the administrator who'd spent 3 hours reading the archive made a decision. She gathered her staff. She showed them the evidence. She asked them a simple question. What do we do when we can no longer deny what we've done? No one answered immediately. But one by one, they began to understand. The Dominion couldn't destroy the archive without destroying itself. Couldn't silence the refugees without broadcasting to the universe that they'd tried. Couldn't go backward into the comfortable darkness because the light had already been turned on. Nix watched from the refugee ship as the Dominion's response began. Not military. Not aggressive. Administrative. Bureaucratic. Officers beginning to file charges against previous command structures. Systems beginning to process the implications of what they'd been asked to enforce. We were ordered to erase a species. We were ordered to maintain silence. We were ordered to forget. And now, forced to read the archive, forced to acknowledge the evidence, the Dominion was being asked to confront what it had done. Kess approached Nix in the observation deck. The child still didn't speak, but now the cloth filled with drawings had a new image. Ships landing. Stars being returned to the sky. A world being unquarantined. We did it, Kess seemed to be saying through the drawings. We made them listen. We made them acknowledge. Nix looked at the child and saw something that the Dominion could never understand. The power of refusal. The power of a 7-year-old drawing pictures of a world that had been taken away, and in drawing them, making the taking away real to anyone who saw, making the grief tangible, making the loss matter. The refugee fleet entered the capital's orbital space without resistance, not because the Dominion had surrendered, but because they were no longer unified in their will to fight. The archive had done what weapons never could. It had split the Empire's certainty. All ships maintained broadcast integrity. Vance commanded, continue the archive transmission. Let them listen. Let them understand what they've done. Thorne watched the Dominion's defensive systems stand down, one platform at a time. Some officers evacuating. Some officers choosing to remain at their posts and watch the refugee fleet arrive. Some officers beginning to contemplate what accountability looked like when an empire committed genocide. The pre-twist mundane beat was over. The capital waited. The liberated prison Camplock had been brought aboard the refugee fleet 3 days before the jump. It was nothing remarkable to look at a physical mechanism, corroded from years of sealing confined spaces, marked with the serial numbers of thousands of species that had passed through the detention facility before being deported to quarantine zones. Nix held it in her hands as the refugee fleet approached the capital's central docking station. This lock held them, she said quietly. Vance understood what Nix meant, not just the physical constraint of the mechanism, but what it represented. Every species the Dominion had imprisoned, every quarantine enforced, every silence maintained, all of it symbolized in this single, corroded object. What will you do with it? Vance asked, mounted on the hull of the new Assembly's flagship. Nix said, make it a memorial. Make it a reminder that this is what resistance looks like, not strength, refusal. The refugee fleet docked, 4,000 people beginning to disembark. Some toward temporary quarters, some toward the Dominion's administrative centers, where they would be required to give testimony about what quarantine had meant. Some toward the archive stations, where they would help integrate Earth records into the Dominion's official history. Kess walked off the refugee ship holding Nix's hand. The child's drawings had been collected, archived, integrated into the official record. 4,000 pictures of trees and water and ships and stars. 4,000 pieces of testimony from someone who'd never spoken a word. In the temporary headquarters, the administrator who dread the archive for 3 hours met with Vance face to face. The Dominion is willing to negotiate terms of reparation, the administrator said formally. All professional courtesy, all bureaucratic distance, compensation for the 10-year period of enforced quarantine, restoration of resource access, recognition of your species' rights within Dominion space. Vance listened. But we would also request, the administrator continued carefully, that River Chet expected, that the refugees provide testimony regarding what Earth was doing during the quarantine. The Dominion's intelligence agencies are concerned that there may be other species engaged in similar insurgent activities. In other words, Thorne said, not bothering to mask the dark humor in his voice, you want us to help you predict the next rebellion. The administrator's shoulders stiffened slightly, a siltate gesture of discomfort. The Dominion would like to understand the failure that allowed Earth to survive undetected for 10 years. The failure, Nix said, was that you assumed silence meant obedience. You assumed that if you turned off the lights, the species would stay in the dark. You didn't account for the possibility that we'd learn to navigate by refusal alone. The administrator processed this. The archive will be maintained, she said finally. All species can access it now. All quarantined worlds can verify what's been done to them. The Dominion will not be able to implement new silence protocols without confronting the evidence of past ones. It wasn't victory. Nix understood that clearly. Empires didn't apologize or truly change, but they could be forced to acknowledge, forced to maintain permanent records of their failures, forced to accept that Erasure was no longer possible. The quiet close moved like a ship finding harbor after 10 years in the void. Nix stood on the observation deck of a new refugee ship assigned to the assembled fleet that would be called the Remembrance Fleet, a name no one needed to explain. The lock was being mounted on the hull now, a permanent fixture, a memorial that every being in Dominion space would see. Below, in the observation deck, Kess continued drawing, but the pictures had changed again. No longer ships or trees or memories of what was lost. Now the child drew this, drew the lock being mounted, drew the fleet being named, drew the act of refusing to forget. The archive continued broadcasting, not because it needed to anymore, but because silence was no longer an option anyone could impose. The Dominion would read its own records forever now, confronting its own failures in its own systems. Thorne approached with the final manifest. The one Nix had folded in the refugee hold 3 days before the jump began. It was worn now from handling, from being read, from being verified by Dominion analysts who confirmed every specification, every timeline, every act of defiance. What will we do with this? Thorne asked. Nix looked at the paper in her hands, thought about 10 years of documentation, 10 years of refusal, 10 years of insisting that Earth existed even when the universe was trying to erase it. Mounted inside the lock, she said, let the Dominion let everyone see what documentation looks like when it becomes rebellion. The manifest was placed inside the liberated prison camp lock. Physical proof. Living archive. The thing that empires feared most, permanent memory. The Remembrance fleet moved into permanent orbit around the capital. Not conquered. Not defeated. But present. Undeniable. Refusing to be invisible. And on the hull of the flagship, the lock held the course. Paper and steel. Refusal and remembrance intertwined. The thing Earth had learned to understand in 10 years of hiding, that survival wasn't about weapons. It was about making sure that when the Empire tried to erase you, anyone would be able to read the proof that you'd refused to disappear. The lock held the course.